I am pretty miffed. I'm miffed with things that are happening in the world at the moment. I'm miffed at one or two things a little closer to home. And I'm now ever so slightly even more miffed because I've just finished watching The Expendables 4, which was such a wet fart of a film. If you could even honour it with such a description. Or sorry, The Expendables. Yeah, that's really what it's called, to give you an idea of how out of touch the producers are. I'm a huge fan of 80s action movies. I grew up on films like Die Hard, Aliens, Lethal Weapon, and the barrage of films Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger did. Then, in the late 90s, as visual effects heavy films started to gain traction, the need for muscle bound heroes to flex their biceps on their way to take out the bad guy and win the girl started to dissipate. Both Arnie and Sly had less hits and began fading away. The turn of the century saw a steady decline in big budget R-rated action films for many reasons, which isn't the point of this video, but greed being a key one, as PG-13 films, in theory, get more butts in seats. But we reached a point where, much like the gangster film, proper old school action films were sparse, and action movie fans were like thirsty Bedouins wandering aimlessly in the desert, fooled at every turn by mirages which turned out to be subpar, lame Steven Seagal flicks that belonged in the discount bin. With superheroes all the rage, IPs favoured over individual star power, and a whole lot of other things, just to get a decent R-rated action flick in cinemas was a big deal. Of course, things aren't as bad now. We've got films like Fury Road, the John Wick movies, and others. Streaming has re-injected a bit of diversity into the mix, so now that every action hero isn't wearing his underpants on the outside. And of course, if audiences are willing to venture outside of English-speaking movies, they'll find modern-day classics like The Raid. Anyway, the point I'm making here is that when Stallone decided to make a movie called The Expendables, an entire franchise born from a single line from First Blood Part 2, adult action films were dead, the 80s stars were all old and flabby, and it was a genius idea, a brilliant concept to get together all, or at least a fair chunk, of the action stars of old and put them all in the same film. What an idea! An action film that would hark back to the 80s, starring all of our favourite action heroes in the same film for the first time. Gone are the days where guys like Stallone and Arnie would turn down Face Off for not wanting to play the bad guy. Now that their careers were in their twilight stage, they didn't have such big egos and were willing to hop aboard. The first film alone boasted Stallone, Schwarzenegger, Bruce Willis, and really that's more than enough. Jet Li, Jason Statham, Dolph Lundgren, Mickey Rourke, and others thrown into the mix for dramatic talent, comedy, or fame from outside of film, like Eric Roberts, Terry Crews, and Steve Austin. I don't think anyone realistically thought it was going to be an amazing film. Even back then there were jokes about the cast being senior citizens and the films being an ego trip. But saying that, look at, Harrison Ford playing Indy at 80. Things are actually much worse now. But it was an opportunity, a throwback for us action fans. And with Stallone himself in the director's seat, we were in safe hands. There was just one problem though. The execution was terrible. Now don't get me wrong, I've been watching bits and pieces of the first film recently and it isn't horrific. There's much to commend, and at the very least it feels like a real film, which is more than I can say for the fourth film, which had a budget of $100 million, and I genuinely think there was some kind of fraud or money laundering going on with that movie, because there's no way that film cost $100 million. Anyway, they dropped the ball on The Expendables, which should have really been a special film, a very special film for action movie fans, a last hurrah of a bygone era. Like I said, it isn't terrible, but the first Expendables film is just mediocre. It's just there. It offers very little. And let's be honest, it was just boring for much of its runtime. What was it even about? Something about a South American general, a CIA guy gone rogue, something weak and cliche, whatever. I think one of the movie's key flaws is that it took itself way too seriously. Stallone got the wrong idea. He thought we wanted to see his 62-year-old wrinkly ass and painted on eyebrows running around trying to save a South American woman from tyranny and grimace and groan in an uber-serious action flick. There were like 3 or 4 action scenes in this film. The last is probably the best action scene in the entire franchise, but still, the rest of them are pretty poor. For a film that sold itself as a throwback to 80s action films, The Expendables is plagued with the problems of modern action films. poor CGI blood effects instead of squibs, the camera shaking all over the place, and as mentioned, a dark tone that takes itself way too seriously. But the whole setup is wrong. The whole thing is off from the get-go. If you are going to have all these big names in the movie, don't have them in the same team. Pit them against each other. Make some of them the bad guys. And, don't be afraid to kill them off. It's called the Expendables after all. But there's no imagination. Everyone is on the same team. They all look the same, dress the same. There's hardly any individuality. Sure, Jason Statham, who for some reason is the co-lead with Stallone when there were far better candidates, he's the one with the knives. Dolph is supposed to be the reckless one. There's a bit of that. But it's lacking in imagination and just settles for the names to sell it. But these characters, we don't remember their names and personalities like we did with these guys' films in the 80s. Those films were fun and memorable. This one was just dull, gloomy and depressing for a lot of it. Schwarzenegger and Willis only had 5-minute cameos. I remember this infuriating me at the time. It isn't so bad now as they got more screen time in the second film, but it was simply ridiculous to have these three kings of action cinema in the same scene. A good scene, but one where they talk for a bit and then that's it. The second film is by far the best film in the franchise. It was what the first film should have been. I had a great time with it. It was fun, it was self-aware, it wasn't too self-serious and important. It was just a simple action romp that made full use of its cast. The jokes and one-liners were on point. Its main flaw is that it probably swung too far in the other direction from the first film, in that it sometimes felt like a parody of an action film. It was too comedic, wacky and self-referential. Take that scene where Arnie says, "I'll be back," and Bruce Willis says, "You've been back enough, I'll be back." Makes no sense within the context of the film, but it was hilarious. But then Arnie says, "Yippee-ki-yay," and then, who's next? Rambo? Which just killed the joke. Not to mention the way he pronounced it, it sounded like rainbow.
Who's next? Rambo?
It also looked kind of cheap and B-movie-ish. Many of the talking scenes are unmemorable, but those are really my only complaints. The movie knows what you want, and it delivers. Rambo, John McClane and the Terminator kicking ass and mowing down bad guys in a revenge mission. Van Damme was a cool villain. Scott Adkins as the henchman was the icing on the cake. The opening action scene was terrific, well edited and flows really well. Especially the segment with Jet Li running out of bullets and he starts smashing people with pots and pans. That blend of action and humour sums up the film pretty well. It utilises its cast way more than its predecessor and plays on their reputation. Take Chuck Norris for example. He's almost a mythical creature in the movie, and they even get a Chuck Norris joke in there. The middle area, like most Expendables movies, is the most unmemorable, but the final third of the film is great fun and somewhat delivers on the promise of the entire franchise, the closest this series ever got to greatness. Sure, the wide angles and lack of shaky cam does kind of make it obvious that for the most part these action scenes with the likes of Arnie and Willis are them just standing there, but they're old. It's better than the camera being all over the place and not being able to see anything like the first film. If the Expendables 2 was fan service on steroids, the third film was anything but. As followers of the franchise will tell you, the producers got greedy with the third movie, making it PG-13 to draw in a younger crowd, shunning much of the established cast and bringing in bland MMA fighters, boxers and whatnot, who apparently the kids today love. In the story, the villain played by Mel Gibson shoots Terry Crews in the ass. He doesn't die or anything, but for some reason that's enough for Stallone to disband the Expendables and not risking his friends' lives. And he goes after Gibson with some young blood. Doesn't make much sense because these guys are hardcore mercenaries. But the story template isn't as bad as I remember. It's just that when the young guys get captured by the baddies and the 80s action stars have to bail them out, it's too late in the film, and by then most of us have already mentally checked out. And for a huge chunk of it, it wasn't actually the kids that hogged up the screen time, but Stallone himself, who was on a solo mission for much of the film. It was a major clangor of a decision to alienate fans by making the film PG-13 and sidelining the action stars for these new guys. Kids today are not interested in the Expendables. They were never going to see films like these. And the producers should have known better than to try and compete with the likes of the Fast and Furious franchise. Instead, they lost the original fan base and failed to replace it. Perhaps more than any entry, The Expendables 3 is carried by its star power. A film that left a major bad taste in my mouth. It at least had a great pantomime villain in Gibson, and brought along Wesley Snipes, Antonio Banderas, and Harrison Ford for the ride. Bruce Willis was a major miss, and most of the original cast don't do much. Honestly, I don't even remember much about this film. It's one of the few times I've actively wanted a film to fail because of what they did with the rating, and the movie didn't do much to win me over. It's crazy how 3 movies into a series they're still trying to work out the tone. A disappointing and flaccid follow-up to the second film, which had promised a better future for the series. Stallone would eventually apologise for the PG-13 rating and promised the next one would be bloody and R-rated. And the fourth truly cemented the franchise as becoming the very thing it was supposed to be a fight back against. Sure, the R rating was back, if by that you mean digital red flying across the screen every so often. But this film is truly an insult, a shameless, shameful, tired entry that doesn't even feel connected to the rest of the series. They didn't even use the fantastic Expendables soundtrack. The CGI was jaw-droppingly atrocious, the actors look checked out and bored, and the editing is insane. For example, the team in the beginning have a bit of banter. Read that as excruciatingly cringe dialogue. They get together, they plan their attack, and they head off for action. A series of scenes which must have taken place over a few days, but these are intercut with a villain attack on a base, which presumably took only an hour or so. Very strange editing. There's something very off with this film. I mean, for one, it feels so empty. Where is everyone? No Schwarzenegger, no Willis, no Jet Li, none of the guys who came in the second or third film. Stallone disappears about 15 minutes in and shows up at the end, making this the Jason Statham show with his sidekicks. Said sidekicks being Megan Fox for some reason, and a lost-looking 50 Cent who speaks like this in the film. Iko Uwais is wasted as the villain. The sheer audacity of getting a fantastic martial artist and filming his fight scenes with a schizophrenic cameraman. Tony Jaa is in it, and incredibly the movie doesn't do the obvious and give us a fight scene with both of them. In fact, I don't even think they shared the screen. Andy Garcia pops up to remind everyone he's still around, and Dolph Lundgren, a fun supporting character from previous films as the comic relief, looked practically ill. And on a serious note, literally while I was making this review, I discovered he is actually battling an illness, so I guess he does have an excuse. Randy Couture might actually have the most amount of lines in the film, and he's one of the Expendables you forget even exists. There was a shot where the gang was walking in slow motion towards the camera, and it was almost sad how bare-boned the team looked. About 5 guys, 2 of them being the most unmemorable of the original Expendables, and then the others being whoever the producers were able to seduce with a decent contract. It looked so poor. There are scenes where, for example, there'll be a close-up of an actor, and then a shot of a random explosion, and then back to the actor looking shocked. Just that kind of cheap, choppy filmmaking where it's clear different clips and shots were taken from different shoots and hastily slapped together. It's a disgrace. It really does feel like, and I mean this, the kind of film you'd find lying deep at a discount bin sold in 3s. It's just awful. Not just a bad action movie, a serious insult to the craft. They knowingly released a piece of shite. Everyone looks like they'd rather be somewhere else. The special effects are insulting, and I think this feeling of knowing you're making a piece of crap was shared with whoever made it. I didn't see any interviews about this movie. I didn't see Stallone hyping it, nothing. It was just farted out into cinemas, and now it's gone. A far cry from the days of the Expendables 1 and 2, which now appear glorious, basking in their magnificence with their noses stuck up at what came after, even though they weren't that great to begin with. This should have been something special, this franchise, and yet it got dogged with stupid decision making and lazy craftsmanship, resulting in really only 1 film out of 4 worth watching, 1 making you depressed, the other angry, and 1 making you feel just nothing. Truly shambolic and a dismal series in retrospect, one that has so much promise and is ultimately relegated to being a missed opportunity.